Melody Parker had always prided herself on her independence, a quiet accountant navigating the predictable rhythms of her life in a bustling New York office building. At 26, she had carved out a modest existence in a cramped apartment on the Lower East Side, where her evenings were filled with takeout Thai food, binge, watching cooking shows, and the occasional phone call to her younger brother Jake, who was buried in medical school loans and dreams of becoming a surgeon. Her father, a shadowy figure from her childhood who had vanished 5 years earlier amid whispers of shady deals and unpaid loans, was a ghost she preferred to ignore. That rainy Monday afternoon, as she returned from her lunch break, clutching a greasy box of donuts, her guilty pleasure amid the monotony of spreadsheets and coffee stains, everything shattered. The thunderous whir of helicopter blades drowned out the city hum, and before she could duck behind a rooftop column, 3 men in crisp black suits emerged like figures from a thriller novel. At their center was Dante Rossy, a man who exuded an effortless command, his dark hair windswept, sunglasses perched on a face chiseled by what seemed like years of calculated decisions. He strode toward the terrace door with the confidence of someone who owned not just the building, but the very air around it, leaving Melody frozen, her heart pounding in a mix of confusion and inexplicable dread. Dante's voice cut through the downpour like velvet over steel, laced with a subtle accent that hinted at Mediterranean roots, perhaps Italian, she guessed, though she had no time to dwell. "Miss Parker," he said, removing his sunglasses to reveal piercing brown eyes that held secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. "I'm Dante Rossy. We need to talk. It's about your father." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't uttered it aloud in years, not since the bitter argument that had severed their already fragile ties, when he'd begged for money she didn't have, rambling about one last investment that would fix everything. "My father died 3 years ago," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt, though her knuckles whitened around the donut box. "Boat explosion off the coast. I don't know what game this is, but I'm just an accountant here. Wrong person." Dante stepped closer, undeterred by the rain, slicking his tailored suit, a faint scar above his left eyebrow catching the dim light like a warning. "He didn't die, Melody, and even if he had, the debt he owed my family doesn't vanish with him. $3 million. That's what we're here to settle." Her mind reeled, fragments of half-remembered arguments flashing, her father's late-night calls, the unexplained cash stashes, the way he'd always promised she'd be taken care of. But this was madness, a nightmare scripted by some cruel playwright who hated happy endings. As the rain intensified, drumming against the rooftop like accusatory fingers, Dante gestured to one of his men, who produced a sleek tablet glowing with digital legalese. "Your father signed this contract 5 years ago," he explained, his tone matter of fact, as if discussing a routine merger rather than the ruination of her life. In exchange for the funds that kept his schemes afloat, he pledged his daughter's hand to the Rossy heir, you to me, in essence. It's ironclad, notarized, witnessed, legal in every sense. Melody snatched the tablet, her eyes scanning the familiar scrawl of her father's signature at the bottom, the date aligning perfectly with that fateful fight when he'd stormed out, vowing she'd regret not helping him. The document outlined it all. The debts accrual from high stakes loans for dubious ventures, the collateral of familial bonds in lieu of repayment, and the clause that activated upon his untimely demise or disappearance. Her laughter bubbled up, bitter and hollow, echoing off the concrete pillars. "This is insane. Medieval. You can't just collect people like overdue library books. I'm not property. I have a life, bills, a job, friends who think I'm allergic to drama." Dante's expression softened fractionally, a flicker of something almost human crossing his features, but his resolve remained unyielding. "I understand this is a shock, Believe me, I didn't seek this out. But debts like these don't forgive, and neither do the families who hold them. The wedding is set for next Saturday. We can make it civil, or we can make it complicated. Your choice." The confrontation escalated as Melody paced the slick terrace, her sneakers squeaking against the wet surface, the discarded donuts forgotten and dissolving in the puddles at her feet. Next Saturday. Today is Monday! That's 5 days to append my entire existence for a man I met 5 minutes ago. What if you're a serial killer? Or worse, a vegetarian who lectures about ethics over steak? Dante's men shifted uncomfortably, but he merely raised an eyebrow, a ghost of amusement tugging at his lips despite the gravity. "I'm not a serial killer, and I eat meat, rare, preferably. But this isn't about preferences, it's about obligation. Your father wasn't just borrowing money, he was entangled in a web that spanned continents, and you were his safety net." She fired back with a barrage of protests, her voice rising over the storm. Accusations of coercion, demands for proof beyond a digital signature, wild threats of fleeing to Mexico or joining a convent. Yet beneath the fury simmered a deeper terror, the fragility of her world, built on the illusion of control after years of her father's chaos. Dante countered with calm precision, pulling up encrypted files on the tablet that detailed wire transfers, promissory notes, even photos of her father shaking hands with shadowy figures in smoke-filled backrooms. "This isn't a bluff," he said softly, his accent thickening with emotion. "It's legacy. My family built an empire on trust and repayment. Yours, well, let's just say your father gambled away more than money." As the helicopter's rotors began to spin again, signaling his departure, Melody felt the ground tilt, her independence crumbling like the rain-soaked pastries at her feet. What sealed her reluctant surrender wasn't the contract or the threats to her autonomy, but the cruel leverage Dante wielded next her brother Jake. As she slumped against the column, breath ragged from the verbal sparring, Dante tapped the tablet once more, revealing a ledger of Jake's mounting gambling debts, 100,000 racked up in desperate online poker sessions to fund his med school tuition, hidden from her like a shameful secret. "He's your only family left," Dante said, his voice stripped of triumph, almost regretful. "Bright kid, wrong choices. If you walk away, those debts become my problem to collect. And I assure you, my methods are far less forgiving than a courtroom." Melody's world narrowed to the screen's glow, Jake's naive face flashing in her mind, his goofy grins at Thanksgiving, his late-night study calls begging for advice on anatomy exams. He was the one pure thing left from her fractured childhood, the sibling who'd promised they'd escape their father's shadow together. Tears blurred the numbers, but the math was merciless, her freedom for his future, a devil's bargain wrapped in fraternal love. "You bastard," she whispered, but the fight drained from her like the receding storm clouds. Dante nodded, as if he'd expected no less. "Call it what you will, but it's the reality we both inherit. 1 year, Melody. Play the part and then you're free. Divorce papers signed, debts cleared, no strings. Refuse and Jake learns what real pressure feels like." As the helicopter lifted off, leaving her sodden and shattered on the rooftop, Melody dialed Jake's number with trembling fingers, the first threads of their tense union already weaving resentment and reluctant intrigue into the fabric of her unraveling life. Melody Parker had always envisioned her life as a carefully balanced ledger, entries of modest successes and minor setbacks neatly aligned in the columns of her accounting spreadsheets. At 26, she inhabited a world of quiet routines in the humming heart of New York City, her days spent in a fluorescent, lit office poring over tax forms and balance sheets for faceless corporations that demanded precision but offered little in return. Her evenings unfolded in the dim glow of her tiny Lower East Side apartment, where the air carried the faint tang of street vendor falafel and the distant wail of sirens. a symphony she had grown accustomed to, even fond of, as it underscored her hard-won independence. Born to a father whose charm masked a labyrinth of poor decisions and vanishing acts, Melody had learned early to distrust grand gestures and empty promises. Her mother had passed when she was 12, leaving behind a void filled only by her younger brother Jake, whose infectious optimism and medical school ambitions were the sole anchors in her otherwise solitary sea. Jake, 2 years her junior, was the baby of the family, the one she'd shielded from their father's escalating deceptions. The late-night whispers of "on more deal" that never panned out, the unexplained absences that stretched into weeks. On that fateful Monday afternoon, as gray clouds pregnant with autumn rain loomed over the city, Melody stepped out of the elevator onto the rooftop terrace for a breath of fresh air during her lunch break, clutching a spotted box of donuts from the corner bodega, her small rebellion against the monotony of kale salads and motivational podcasts. The sudden roar of helicopter blades shattered the fragile peace, whipping her ponytail into a frenzy and sending discarded napkins skittering across the concrete like startled leaves. She ducked instinctively behind a rusted support column, her heart thudding against her ribs, only to watch 3 men in impeccably tailored black suits descend from the aircraft with the synchronized menace of a SWAT team extraction. At their forefront strode Dante Rossy, a figure who seemed sculpted from the shadows of power plays and boardroom battles. Tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair tousled by the downdraft, aviator sunglasses shielding eyes that, even from afar, promised depths she wasn't prepared to plumb. He moved with predatory grace toward the terrace door, as if the rooftop were merely an extension of his domain, leaving Melody's mind reeling with questions. Who were they? What did they want? And why, in the midst of this intrusion, did a traitorous spark of curiosity flicker amid her fear? Dante's voice, when it called her name, "Miss Parker," rolled like distant thunder, deep and resonant with an accent that evoked sun-baked olive groves and whispered vendettas, perhaps Sicilian or Tuscan, though the exact origin eluded her in the moment. She emerged from her hiding spot, donut box clutched like a talisman, her sensible flats rooted to the spot as rain began to patter against the gravel. "I'm Dante Rossy," he continued, slipping off his sunglasses to reveal irises the color of aged whiskey, flecked with gold and shadowed by experiences that aged a man far beyond his apparent 30-odd years. A faint scar arched above his left eyebrow, a silvery reminder of some untold skirmish, adding to the aura of controlled danger that clung to him like cologne. "We need to speak. Privately. It's regarding your father." The word, father, landed like a grenade in still water, rippling through the carefully constructed barriers of her psyche. Richard Parker had been a phantom for 5 years, ever since their explosive confrontation in the cramped kitchen of her childhood home in Queens, a cacophony of shouted accusations about his investments in shadowy offshore ventures, pyramid schemes disguised as real estate flips, and loans from men whose names evoked more fear than familiarity. He'd stormed out that night, the briefcase in hand, vowing she'd rue the day she turned her back on family loyalty, only to vanish into the ether, his trail cold until a terse obituary claimed a boating accident 3 years prior. Melody's throat tightened, her voice emerging steadier than she felt. "My father is dead. Boat explosion. If this is some scam, you've got the wrong mark. I'm just the bean counter on the 15th floor." Dante closed the distance with measured steps, undaunted by the intensifying drizzle that darkened his suit to midnight blue, his presence filling the space between them like an unspoken contract already inked. He didn't die, Melody, at least, not in the way that absolves debts. Richard was entangled with my family, borrowing sums that snowballed into $3 million. And when words failed, he offered collateral pledged to the Rossy heir in matrimony should fate intervene. Her laughter escaped in a sharp, disbelieving bark, echoing off the terrace railings as pigeons scattered from their perches. Collateral, like I'm a vintage watch or a plot of land. This is 2025, not the Godfather era. My father was a dreamer with bad luck, not a mobster's pawn. But even as she protested, fragments of memory resurfaced, the hushed phone calls at dawn, the envelopes of cash vanishing into his glove compartment, the way he'd always deflected questions about his associates, with a wink and a promise of riches. Dante's gaze held hers, unyielding yet tinged with a reluctant empathy, as if he too carried the weight of inherited sins. The revelation unfolded like a meticulously scripted thriller, Dante's aide presenting a tablet whose screen glowed with damning evidence under the terrace's sodium lamps. Scrolling through the document, a labyrinth of legalese drafted by attorneys whose names evoked gilded law firms in Midtown. Melody's eyes snagged on her father's unmistakable signature, a looping flourish she'd forged on school permission slips and holiday cards. Dated precisely to the eve of his disappearance, the contract detailed the debt's genesis: high interest loans for speculative ventures in cryptocurrency laundering disguised as art dealings, favors called in from underground networks that spanned from Little Italy to offshore banks in the Caymans. In exchange for leniency and continued funding, Richard Parker had bound his eldest daughter to the Rossy lineage, a archaic clause invoking familial alliance through sacred union that reeked of old-world machismo and desperation. This can't be binding, she stammered, thrusting the tablet back as if it burned, rain now sluicing down her face in rivulets that blurred her vision. Courts don't enforce human trafficking in the 21st century. Dante's response was calm, almost wary, as he pocketed the device and signaled his men to prepare the chopper's departure. It's not trafficking, it's tradition, sanctified by witnesses and notaries who specialize in such arrangements. The wedding is penciled for next Saturday, small, discreet, at my estate upstate. You'll want time to inform your circle, pack what matters. 5 days. The timeline crashed over her like the chopper's blades, a vortex sucking away her autonomy. The job she'd clawed for after community college, the fragile friendships forged over office happy hours, the dream of a solo trip to Paris she'd pinned to her cubicle wall. Protests tumbled from her lips in a torrent. Accusations of coercion, vows to lawyer up with pro bono advocates from women's shelters, fantasies of vanishing into the city's underbelly like her father before her. Yet Dante stood unmoved, his scar catching the light like a punctuation mark on his resolve, countering each barb with the inexorable logic of legacy. Debts didn't dissolve with death, they metastasized, demanding repayment in flesh or fortune. As the rotors whirred to life, whipping the rain into a frenzy, he paused at the threshold, his voice softening just a fraction. I didn't choose this any more than you did, Melody, but running only accrues interest. 1 year, play the role, and you're free. Divorce irrevocable, debts extinguished. Refuse, and the collectors turn to collateral closer to home. The implication hung unspoken, a shadow lengthening across the terrace as the helicopter ascended, leaving her sodden and seething, the donut box crushed underfoot in a symbol of her crumbling defenses. What truly shackled her to the altar wasn't the contract's cold ink or Dante's unyielding gaze, but the razor-sharp leverage he unveiled in its penultimate clause, a ledger of her brother Jake's indiscretions, the 100 Zalahosen in gambling debts accrued through frantic online wagers to bridge the gaps in his med school tuition. Jake, the golden boy of their fractured family, with his lopsided grins and endless texts about cadaver dissections and midnight cram sessions, had kept his vice hidden behind a facade of boyish charm and borrowed optimism. Melody had scraped together what she could for his loans, oblivious to the digital roulette wheels spinning in the shadows of his dorm room, each loss a deeper cut into their shared vulnerability. As Dante's chopper faded into the steel, gray sky, she sank to the wet concrete. The tablet's glow illuminating Jake's account statements like a prosecutor's exhibit. Transactions time-stamped to late night poker bluffs and desperate blackjack hands. "You can't touch him," she whispered to the empty air, but the words tasted like ash. Dante's parting shot echoed in her mind, a velvet threat wrapped in fox sympathy. "Hayes family to you, as this is to me. One call, and the hounds are loose, bookies with brass knuckles, not courtroom summons." Visions assaulted her, Jake's wide-eyed confusion as collectors pounded on his apartment door, his surgical dreams derailed by repossession notices and shattered credit. The brother who'd vowed to fix everything one day, reduced to the very desperation their father had sown. Tears mingled with rainwater on her cheeks, a bitter cocktail of rage and resignation for Jake's sake. The only tether to innocence in her bloodline, she'd swallow the poison pill, don the white dress, and step into the gilded cage. Dialing his number with numb fingers, she rehearsed the lie, a whirlwind romance. A spontaneous elopement, anything to shield him from the truth that their father's ghosts had clawed their way back, demanding tribute in the form of her future. As Jake's cheerful voicemail chimed, "Hey, it's Jake. Leave a message, or I'll assume you're calling to quiz me on the brachial plexus." Melody's resolve hardened into something brittle yet unbreakable, the first threads of their coerced union weaving resentment, survival, and an unwelcome spark of defiance into the tapestry of her appended life. In the 5 days that blurred into a fever dream of frantic preparations, Melody navigated the chasm between her old self, the pragmatic accountant who budgeted for black swan events like job loss or medical emergencies, and this new incarnation, a reluctant bride bartered like a commodity in a bygone era of arranged alliances. Mornings dissolved into tear-streaked calls to her sparse circle of friends, spinning half-truths about a surprise proposal. From a mysterious entrepreneur to mask the coercion, afternoons were lost to closet purges, folding faded jeans and sensible blouses into donation bins, each item a shed skin of autonomy. Jake, bless his oblivious heart, arrived unannounced on Wednesday with pizza and bad puns, his med school scrubs rumpled from a 12-hour shift. Demanding details on this fiancé who'd swept her off her feet, she fed him the fabricated fairy tale over greasy slices. Dante as the charming restaurateur met at a charity gala, their whirlwind courtship a rom-com montage, while her stomach churned with the unspoken reality, the tablet's damning files burning a hole in her laptop bag. "He sounds perfect," Jake enthused, oblivious to the tremor in her laugh. "But if he hurts you, I'll dissect him alive, scalpel to sternum." His fierce loyalty, so pure and untainted, only deepened the knife twist for him. She'd endure the vows, the veil, the charade, trading her freedom for his unburdened path to scrubs and stethoscopes. Evenings brought solitary vigils on her fire escape chain, smoking menthols she'd sworn off years ago, staring at the glittering skyline that now mocked her with its indifferent vastness. How many secrets did those towers hold? How many debts unpaid? Dante's single follow-up call, midweek and terse, confirmed logistics, a civil ceremony at his Hudson Valley estate. No press, no pomp, just signatures and a photographer for the family album. His voice, stripped of rooftop menace, carried an undercurrent of fatigue, as if he too chafed against the yoke of inheritance. But she hung up before probing deeper, afraid of what humanity she might uncover in the man fate had shackled her to. By Friday night, suitcases zipped and apartment keys surrendered to the super, Melody stood before her fogged bathroom mirror, tracing the stranger's reflection. Pale, determined, a woman forged in the crucible of filial folly, whispering to her ghosts 1 year. For Jake, for survival. As dawn broke on Saturday, the car idled curbside, Vincent at the wheel with stoic silence, ferrying her toward the altar, where debts would be sealed in gold bands and whispered oaths, the arranged marriage not just a chain, but a catalyst for the unforeseen odyssey ahead. As the graffiti, scarred facade of Rossy's Brooklyn loomed under the harsh glare of police floodlights that fateful night, Melody Parker, Rossy stood beside her husband, Dante, in the shadowed alleyway. The acrid tang of spray paint and shattered glass mingling with the distant wail of sirens slicing through the pre-dawn hush. 2 months into their improbable union, a marriage born of desperation and debt, forged in the crucible of reluctant cohabitation and tentative trust, the vandalism had ripped open wounds neither had fully acknowledged. What began as a seemingly random act of malice had unraveled into a tapestry of threats tied to Dante's grandfather's shadowy legacy. Protection rackets disguised as arrangements, favors traded in smoke, filled backrooms of Little Italy speakeasies, debts that lingered like ghosts in the ledgers of families long entangled in New York's underbelly. Detective Morrison's clipped voice over the phone that evening had confirmed the suspicions. Similar hits on other Italian-owned establishments. Messages etched not just in paint but in the bloodlines of those who dared to go legitimate. "It's a shakedown," the detective had growled, his Brooklyn accent thickening with frustration. "Old scores from the 80s, when your nonno was playing both sides. They see you thriving, untethered, and it burns." Dante's face, illuminated by the blue flicker of his phone screen, had hardened into a mask Melody had glimpsed only in fleeting moments of vulnerability. A man torn between the empire he'd built brick by brick, restaurant by restaurant, and the life he now shared with her, a woman who'd entered his world as collateral and stayed as a partner. In the dim confines of his upstairs office, amid stacks of yellowed contracts and faded photos of a younger Dante grinning beside his grandfather outside the original Rossy's on Mulberry Street, she had watched him pace, his Italian loafers scuffing the Persian rug like a caged lion. "I won't let them touch what I've made," he'd vowed, fists clenched, the scar above his eyebrow, a memento from a bar brawl in his wilder 20s, twitching with suppressed rage. But beneath the bravado, Melody saw the fear not for himself, but for her, for the fragile normalcy they'd carved. Lazy Sunday mornings with Maria's cannoli, stolen kisses in the herb garden, whispered confessions of affection that had blossomed from obligation into something perilously close to love. As the hours ticked toward dawn, with Vincent coordinating cleanup crews and Maria brewing endless pots of espresso in the kitchen below, Melody realized the truth that had been simmering since their rooftop confrontation. This wasn't just about debts or legacies. It was about choosing, fiercely and without regret, the life they wanted over the one they'd inherited. The decision crystallized in the quiet aftermath of that chaotic night, as the city stirred awake and the first rays of sun gilded the Hudson Valley estate where their hasty wedding vows had bound them in gold bands and guarded optimism. Melody had always been the pragmatist, the one who balanced books with surgical precision and viewed emotions as variables to be managed rather than indulged, a trait honed by years of propping up Jake's dreams while dodging their father's fallout. Yet, curled on the worn leather sofa in Dante's office, wrapped in one of his cashmere throws that smelled faintly of his cologne, bergamot, and sandalwood, she found her voice cutting through his spiraling calculations of legal fees and counter-threats. "We'll walk away," she said simply, the words hanging in the air like a lifeline tossed into stormy seas. Dante paused mid-stride, his dark eyes, those whiskey-flecked depths that could command boardrooms or unravel her defenses with a single glance, widening in disbelief. "Walk away. From everything. The restaurants, the life I've built, it's not just bricks and mortar, Melody. It's my grandfather's dream, my father's unfinished legacy." She rose then, crossing the room to stand before him, her hands framing his face, thumbs tracing the faint stubble along his jaw that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken burdens. In that touch, She poured out the revelations of their shared months, the way he'd surprised her with cooking lessons in the sun-dappled kitchen, his hands guiding hers over handmade pasta dough as laughter bridged the chasms of their pasts. The quiet evenings on the patio where he'd confessed his fear of isolation, a self-made magnate adrift in a sea of sycophants. The mornings when he'd linger in bed, tracing patterns on her skin, murmuring endearments in Italian that made her heart stutter. "Your legacy isn't in those walls," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "It's in us, in the family we're building, the love that's real despite the madness that started it. If we fight this with more shadows, we become them. But if we choose each other, fully, without the empire's weight, we win." Tears pricked her eyes, not from fear but from the clarity of it. Love wasn't the absence of danger, but the audacity to prioritize it above all else. Dante searched her face, the warlord in him yielding to the man who'd fallen, irrevocably, for the accountant with fire in her veins and spreadsheets in her soul. "North Carolina," he murmured finally, the name a talisman against the encroaching dark. "A Sheville, the mountains, fresh starts, a place where no one knows the Rossy name beyond pasta specials." In that moment, as dawn painted the room in hues of rose and gold, their choice solidified love over legacy, vulnerability over vengeance, a new beginning etched not in contracts, but in the quiet vow to run not from, but toward each other. The logistics of their exodus unfolded like a meticulously orchestrated symphony, a blend of Dante's business acumen and Melody's analytical precision, transforming potential chaos into a blueprint for rebirth. Over the ensuing weeks, the Hudson Valley estate buzzed with subdued activity. Vincent, ever the steadfast sentinel with his broad shoulders and quiet loyalty forged in a decade of driving Dante through neon-lit nights and crisis-laden dawns, coordinated the discreet divestitures. Restaurants sold not in fire sales, but through layered shell companies to eager conglomerates. Proceeds funneled into untraceable trusts that whispered of reinvention rather than retreat. Maria, the silver-haired matriarch whose apron bore the stains of generations and whose ceramic rooster collection rivaled a small museum, orchestrated the household purge with theatrical flair. Heirlooms packed in bubble wrap for the journey south, the prized roosters claiming an entire moving van compartment, while faded photos of Dante Rossy, stern-eyed immigrant with a wooden spoon like Excalibur, were tucked into velvet-lined boxes as talismans of selective memory. Melody, meanwhile, navigated the emotional minefield of farewells, her office cubicle stripped of Paris postcards and replaced with vague emails about a family relocation for fresh opportunities, sparing Janet and her colleagues the full saga of arranged vows and mobbed-up specters. Jake, summoned under the guise of a surprise visit, arrived with his stethoscope slung like a bandolier, only to be enveloped in a tearful huddle where truths spilled like overfilled Chianti, the debt, the marriage, the threats that had nearly claimed his sister's freedom for his folly. "I should have known," he choked, arms around her in a bare hug that smelled of hospital antiseptic and regret. "Let me come with you. I'll drop out, pay it back." But Melody, steeling her heart against his pleas, framed their flight as liberation, not loss. "Stay, Jake. Be the doctor you dreamed of. This isn't goodbye. It's see you at Christmas in the mountains." As movers carted away the last of their life in New York, the king-sized bed, where tentative touches had bloomed into passion, the kitchen island scarred from impromptu pasta nights, the weight of abandonment lifted, replaced by a buoyant anticipation. Dante, ever the strategist, had secured their haven, a sprawling farmhouse on Asheville's outskirts, ringed by mist, shrouded Blue Ridge peaks, with a commercial kitchen ripe for resurrection and a garden plot where Maria could wage war on Carolina clay. Their departure, shrouded in a pre-dawn fog on a crisp November morn, felt less like flight and more like pilgrimage. tires humming southbound on I-81, windows cracked to inhale the first whiffs of pine and possibility, hands intertwined over the console in silent solidarity. Asheville welcomed them not with fanfare, but with the gentle embrace of autumn's palette, leaves aflame in crimson and amber carpeting the winding roads that snaked through the Smoky Mountains, air crisp with the promise of renewal and the faint spice of wood smoke from distant chimneys. The farmhouse, a weathered Victorian with wraparound porches and gables that whispered of southern Gothic tales, stood sentinel on 10 acres of rolling hillside, its white clapboard facade scarred by time but sturdy against the tempests of change. Maria claimed the sun-drenched kitchen immediately, her roosters parading across oak shelves like victorious generals, while she unearthed seed packets from her apron pocket, vowing to coax heirloom tomatoes from the reluctant soil come spring. Vincent, transforming from chauffeur to handyman with the ease of a man who'd long worn many hats, set to fortifying the property, motion, sensor lights winking along the perimeter, a state of the art-safe room disguised as a wine cellar. His new bride Sarah, a bespectacled librarian with a penchant for mystery novels, arriving soon after with armloads of books to stock the shelves. Dante dove into the resurrection of Rossy's Asheville with the fervor of a phoenix, scouting downtown locales amid the city's bohemian bustle of art galleries and microbreweries, negotiating leases with a charm honed in Manhattan boardrooms but softened by the mountain air. The first weeks blurred into a tapestry of adaptation. Bonfires in the backyard where they roasted marshmallows and shared stories of Nano's clandestine gelato recipes, smuggled from Palermo, hikes along the Blue Ridge Parkway where Melody's city, softened lungs burned with exhilaration, Dante's arms steady around her waist as they crested vistas that stretched to eternity, quiet evenings on the porch, swing, rocking to the symphony of crickets and coyote howls, fingers laced as confessions deepened, Dante admitting the hollow ache of his solitary pre-marriage nights, Melody unveiling the armor she'd worn since her father's abandonment, each revelation a brick in the foundation of their unscripted bond. Challenges arose, of course. The sting of homesickness when Jake's holiday card arrived postmarked from a bustling ER in Queens, the bureaucratic tango of new identities. Dante now, Daniel Rossy. On paper, a nod to the brother he'd lost young. The gnawing doubt in sleepless hours when shadows on the curtains evoked phantom threats from a life left behind. Yet in those crucibles, their love tempered, emerging not as fragile flame but enduring hearth. Dante pausing mid-renovation to massage the kinks from her shoulders after long days at the local community college, where she enrolled in culinary arts to complement his empire, Melody surprising him with a handmade sign for the restaurant's grand opening, Rossy's Tea, where legacy meets love, etched in her careful script, by winter's solstice, as snow dusted the evergreens and their first Christmas tree twinkled with ornaments Maria had smuggled from New York, glass-blown gondolas and faded tin soldiers. Their heaven felt less like exile and more like Eden, a testament to the audacity of choosing hearts over histories. 3 years hence, as the Blue Ridge sun dipped low over the thriving sprawl of Rossy's Asheville, a bustling bistro nestled in the city's vibrant heart, its exposed brick walls adorned with local artisan murals and windows fogged from the steam of simmering rag. The echoes of their bold exodus had faded into folklore, a private myth shared only in hushed tones over tiramisu with Maria and Vincent at the scarred oak family table. The restaurant, born from Dante's vision and Melody's meticulous financial blueprints, had blossomed into a cornerstone of the community, drawing foodies from Charlotte and Knoxville with its fusion of Nano's time-honored recipes. Creamy carbonara laced with Appalachian ramps, osso buco infused with wild morel mushrooms, and innovative twists that earned rave reviews in Southern living. Dante, his once haunted eyes now crinkled with genuine mirth, helmed the kitchen like a maestro. Sleeves rolled to elbows, scarred not from street fights, but from enthusiastic knife work, while Melody managed the front of house with the poise of a woman who'd balanced ledgers of loss and found profit in partnership, greeting regulars with warm handshakes, mediating vendor disputes with the same unflappable logic that had once tamed her groom's impulsivity. Their family had expanded in ways unforeseen. A son, Luca, born under a harvest moon, with Dante's whiskey eyes and Melody's determined chin, toddling now through the herb garden Maria, tended with evangelical zeal, her rooster sentinels standing guard amid heirloom blooms that yielded tomatoes sweeter than Sicilian summers. Sarah and Vincent's twins, rambunctious explorers with their father's stoic brow and mother's bookish curiosity, romped alongside Luca in chaotic playdates that spilled from the farmhouse's sprawling yard into the restaurant's back alley, where Tony Carino, relocated from his haunted Staten Island pizzeria, taught them to twirl dough like ninjas. Jake, thriving in his Queen's practice with a fiancée who matched his irrepressible spirit, visited quarterly, his stethoscope swapped for fishing rods on lazy Pisgah Forest afternoons, the scars of his debts long healed by time and Melody's unyielding grace. Regrets. None lingered, though shadows occasionally stirred. A late, night news clip of New York indictments naming ghosts from Dante's past. A anonymous letter postmarked Manhattan that Vincent intercepted with a grunt and a flame. Yet in those moments, as they lay entwined in the master suite overlooking mist-veiled valleys, Melody would trace the map of his scars, whispering, "We chose this. Us, unbroken." And Dante would pull her closer, his breath warm against her temple, every day amore. Legacy was chains, you set me free. Their love, once a fragile graft on the stump of arrangement, had rooted deep, branches heavy with the fruits of forgiveness and fortitude, proof that true happiness blooms not from inheritance, but from the deliberate, defiant act of prioritizing the heart's quiet sovereignty over the clamor of blood-bound empires. In Asheville's embrace, where mountains stood eternal sentinel, Melody and Dante Rossy had not merely survived, they had scripted a saga where love, audacious and unyielding, rewrote the ending to one of enduring dawn.